Sigmund Freud moved into this house, 19 Berggasse, Vienna, in 1890. Hitler came to power in Berlin, and there were bonfires of books written by Freud and other psychoanalysts. In 1938, the Nazis walked into Vienna to be welcomed by throngs shouting Heil Hitler. Gangs of SA roamed the streets, terrorizing at will. Anti-Semitism was an official government policy. In 1938, the swastika went up over the door of 19 Berggasse, and a gang of thugs invaded the apartment of Sigmund Freud. Mrs. Freud offered them the household money, but it wasn't enough. Then Anna Freud conducted them to the safe, where they took a large sum. Freud later said he had never received so much for just one visit. 1 week later, the Gestapo came and searched the premises for allegedly anti-Nazi documents. They took Anna and kept her all day until the American chargé d'affaires intervened. Freud, with great reluctance, realized he had to leave Vienna. The Nazi government made it as difficult as possible for anyone to leave. They would only issue one-way passports, not good for return. Other countries suffering under economic depression and severe unemployment problems were reluctant to accept refugees. W.C. Bullitt, the American ambassador to France, and President Roosevelt used their influence with Germany to help Freud. Princess Marie Bonaparte, a psychoanalyst in Paris, paid a ransom officially called a fugitive tax so that the Nazis would not confiscate Freud's library and possessions. With their help and others, Freud was allowed to leave Vienna with his family and belongings. At this point, August Eichhorn asked Edmund Engelmann for a favor.
August Eichhorn, a friend of mine, was a lay analyst. He was a non-Jew, a close collaborator of Freud and a disciple. He wrote a book, Wayward Youth, which is a classic. And this book deals with the application of psychoanalysis in the treatment of juvenile delinquents in a penal institution. One day, Eichhorn approached me and asked me whether I would be willing to undertake something that would be of utmost importance to psychoanalysis. Freud's apartment was just about to be dismantled and shipped to England, and he would want me to make a photographic record of his living quarters, his office for posterity. He mentioned that this undertaking was not very simple because the apartment was under strict surveillance by the Nazis, who wanted to prevent that other valuables would be smuggled out with Freud's furniture and pieces of art. Also, Freud himself, at this stage of his life, was over 80 years old. He was quite ill, and cancer had been with him since the 20s. So he had become somewhat of a recluse, and he only had contact with his family, with the so-called inner circle, and some of his older patients. So it was therefore necessary to work out a way of taking these pictures without disturbing him. Freud had his set routine every day, and Eichhorn drew a map, a floor plan of the apartment, and we devised a plan how to proceed with taking pictures without disturbing him. Then I went on to take these photographs.
This Roman portrait bust was in a corner of Freud's consulting room, the room in which psychoanalysis took place. Surrounded by antiquities and photographs of ancient ruins, the patient would rest on the rug-covered couch and recount his dreams, his childhood, his entire life. This was the couch upon which the Wolfman, the Rat Man, and many other notable people had spent many hours. Freud himself would sit out of sight of his patients in this well-worn chair, from which he would gaze directly at a table containing objects from past civilizations. Statuettes that were Egyptian, Etruscan, Assyrian, Roman. Statuettes that Freud had found in the antique shops of Vienna. Freud had started collecting antiquities before 1900 and would make periodic visits to dealers in Vienna or any city he was visiting. He collected antiquities of all kinds: urns, stone reliefs, sarcophagus lids, but mostly Egyptian figures. They were displayed all around the room, on the walls, on tables, in cabinets, on top of cabinets. They all had one thing in common. They were of apparent great age and had come from remote places. They were objects that were connected directly to burial or had been buried by some natural upheaval. And almost all had been unearthed by digging into the ruins of the past. It was a process that Freud used as an analogy to his own work. He wrote that his role resembles to a great extent an archaeologist's excavation of some dwelling place that had been destroyed and buried. On the wall near the foot of the couch was a reproduction of the Pompeian relief Gradiva, which was the subject of a story about which Freud wrote an essay delving into the unconscious and its relationship to creativity. Adjoining it was an engraving of Oedipus and the Sphinx. Above the couch was a color lithograph of the colossal statues at Abu Simbel. There was virtually no contemporary artwork or even landscapes on the walls or around the room. Freud's interest was in antiquities and not necessarily art. Although such antique collecting was not uncommon among doctors in Vienna of his time, his collection is remarkable for its size and better than average quality. At times he would use some of these ancient objects to elucidate his system of dream symbols. In 1899, in a letter to a friend, he wrote of his predilection for the prehistoric in all its human forms. And later on he wrote that the glimpses of ancient cultures had been an unsurpassable comfort to him. Stepping through the door to Freud's study, we find more antiquities among shelves and shelves of books. This was the room that contained his library, in which he would write his own books. At this time he was writing Moses and monotheism, and perhaps he would occasionally gaze out of this window into the courtyard. Freud's library contained, among its many volumes, complete collections of Shakespeare, Goethe, Hawthorne, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Poe, Mark Twain, Greek tragedy, and many books on archaeology. He once said that he had read more archaeology than psychology. Situated between Freud's chair and the chair of a visitor was this little group of figures, which served as a kind of visual buffer between Freud and his visitor. This Coptic head, Egyptian sarcophagus, and Buddhas was situated on a table behind the visitor's chair. On the wall behind these were photographs of Marie Bonaparte, Yvette Gilbert, whom he had met in Paris, and Lou Andreas Salome. Freud wrote in longhand at this desk, which held some of his, as he called them, friends. He knew them all intimately and would sometimes touch one or another of them while talking. It was in these two rooms that Freud discovered and wrote of the major theories of psychoanalysis.
One day while taking pictures, I found myself face to face with Freud. I was very surprised. He seemed to be even more surprised and, as I could notice, quite concerned. Fortunately, Eichhorn was nearby, and he stepped in and he explained the purpose of my mission. At this point, I already had a little album prepared of photographs of previous days, which I planned to give to Freud to take along to England as a souvenir. So I gave it to Freud. Freud looked through the album, started to smile, was very pleased and readily consented to pose for my photographs and even gave me permission to take his pictures while he was working. After a few days, he brought one of these pictures back with an inscription for me, which reads, literally translated from German, "Heartfelt thanks to the artist Freud, 1938. I treasure this picture.
In 1938, when Mr. Engelmann took these photographs, Freud was over 80, had had cancer of the jaw for nearly 15 years. It was very painful and required almost daily treatment. This was done in this little room just off the consulting room. Freud's personal physician or his daughter Anna would attend to the always troublesome wound. Anna Freud, by this time in her 40s, unmarried, was a practicing lay analyst and the only one of Freud's 5 children who still lived at home. Her room was simply furnished and featured this large portrait of her father. The living quarters of the Freud family were adjacent to the offices and faced directly onto Bergasse Street. However, they had very little else in common with the offices. Here there were no walls and cabinets covered with antiquities. Rather, the cabinets contained mementos of a more personal nature. The apartment could have belonged to any middle-class, moderately successful doctor in Vienna. Here, in these rooms with flowers and pictures of children, there was no indication of an interest in archaeology or psychology, and certainly not an indication of an interest in the human unconscious and the problems of sexual repression. Freud and his family had lived in these rooms for more than 45 years, and now they had to leave the country.
Several weeks after I had taken these pictures, Freud and his family left for England. The content of his apartment and offices were shipped to London. In the following month, the fury of Nazi persecution increased, culminated in the so-called Crystal Night, in which hordes of people roamed the street, smashed windows of Jewish enterprise, and set synagogues on fire. At this point, I realized that I had to, in order to save myself, I had to put my efforts, my extreme efforts, into leaving this country. I finally succeeded, and in January 1939, I was able to leave. However, I was afraid to take these negatives along. At the border, they might find them suspicious and retain me. So I decided to leave these negatives with my friend Eichhorn. I left and finally came to the United States, where I started a new life. After World War II, I tried to contact Eichhorn in order to get my negatives back. He was not at the same address, and it was quite difficult to locate a person in the confusion after the war. Finally, when I was able to locate his new address, I had to learn that he had died. Consequently, my efforts and my search led to success, and I learned that Anna Freud had my negatives and finally handed them over to me in London. At this occasion, I was able to visit 20 Marisfield Gardens, where Freud had spent the last year in his life, where I could see that beautiful art again that I had photographed about 15 years ago.
Near these beloved antiquities, Freud died in London in September 1939, a little more than a year after having moved there. These objects are still in the possession of the Freud family in London. But the look and feeling of the rooms in which Freud lived and worked for more than 40 years exists only in these photographs. The Austrian government has made a museum for Freud in his old quarters in 19 Burggasse, but the furniture and antiquities are not there. It was in these rooms and among these objects, as depicted in these photographs, that concepts such as unconscious, sublimation, repression, reality principle, and so on, were defined in a manner to make them virtually household words. It was here that the great books of psychoanalysis were written. Perhaps most important, as Freud wrote to a friend in June 1900, in this house on July 24th, 1895, the secret of dreams was revealed to Dr. Sigmund Freud.